Okay, good morning. Following the miraculous birth of the State of Israel and the miraculous and dramatic unification of Jerusalem and reclamation of the Temple Mount, the Chief Rabbinate, together with leading poskim here in Israel, established Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim as full-fledged festivals with the recitation of Hallel and other special tefillot. If you're interested in this week's Torah Tidbits, I have a whole piece about Yom Yerushalayim, the institution of Yom Yerushalayim, the steps and stages and incarnations that it went through. But the question, which was debated by many poskim at the time, is it even permissible to create a new holiday, to add a holiday to the Jewish calendar, to the Luz HaIvri? The Ramban here in source number 1, in his Perush to Parashat Ve'etchanan, defines the Isur, the prohibition of Bal Tosif, adding to the mitzvot HaTorah, and writes that creating a new festival is an example of Bal Tosif, this prohibition of adding to the mitzvot HaTorah. So some objected to the idea of adding a new holiday, creating Yom HaAtzmaut and later Yom Yerushalayim, and they pointed to the Ramban. But the question is, what kind of holiday does the Ramban mean when he says it's prohibited to add a new holiday to the Jewish calendar? Take a look at source number 1 where I've underlined. He writes, Ulefi da'ati, in my opinion, afilu b'dala asot mitzvah b'fnei atzma. If a person decides to create, to come up with some sort of mitzvah, meaning often Bal Tosif is understood to mean adding to an existing mitzvah. For example, putting a 5th parsha in the tefillin. The tefillin contain 4 parshiot. So to add a 5th parsha would be Bal Tosif. But what the Ramban says here is that maybe even adding a new mitzvah to the Torah is also a violation of the Isur of Bal Tosif. Kigon, and he writes, for example, She'asa chag b'chodesh shebedam milibo ki rav am. For instance, a person wants to add a holiday or create a holiday like Yeravam. Okay, we'll talk about Yeravam in just a moment. Over belav, the Ramban says he is in violation of this lo ta'aseh, this negative prohibition. And I think it's significant that he cites Yeravam ben Navat, okay, as an example. And then he continues, Zakach amru, le'inen mikra megillah, 180 nevi'im amdu lahem li'Yisrael, velo pachto, velo hosifu, velo pachatu, velo hosifu, al ma shekatuv b'Torah, afilu od achat chutz mikra megillah, my darush, etc. He cites a Gemara in Megillah, and Daf Yudalid, which would seem to suggest that it wasn't so simple to add the holiday of Purim, or to institute the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah. There were 180 prophets, and neither of them or none of them added or subtracted from the Torah, except for Mikra Megillah. Mikra Megillah is a Takanat Nevi'im, okay? So, and that had to be justified. If you're familiar with the discussion in the Gemara in Megillah on Daf Zayin, you have a whole discussion about instituting the festival and accepting the book of Esther into the Tanakh. Esther says, Kivuni lidorot, establish me for generations, meaning create a holiday for me, commemorate this miracle, because the Chachamim were hesitant at first. Okay, and she says, Zichruni lidorot, remember me for generations, meaning, or kitvuni lidorot, rather, write me down for generations, meaning include this book into the canon, into the Tanakh, because the Chachamim were also hesitant at first to include Megillat Esther into our Tanakh. They weren't sure if it was written Biruach HaKodesh. So you see, what the Ramban is saying here is even with Purim, it wasn't so simple for Purim and Mikra Megillah to be established. Okay, that was a chidush, so to speak. So Kal Vachomer, if someone just wants to stam create a holiday, you know. Ubi-Yerushalmi 85 zkenim umehem kama nevi'im hayu mitztarim al hadavar. He cites the Yerushalmi there in Megillah, that there were 85 elders, and among them were prophets, and they were also mitztarim, not literally upset, but they were hesitant. I think I would translate mitztarim here as hesitant to establish Purim and include Esther in the Tanakh and institute this formal reading of the Megillah. Okay, so the question, of course, is, what does the Ramban mean here? Now, it's interesting, first of all, that the Ramban cites Yeravam ben Nevat. And he says that one who creates a new holiday, like Yeravam ben Nevat, he is in violation of Baal Tosif, adding to the Mitzvot HaTorah. And I think that's very important and should draw our attention. We need some background first. Who was Yeravam ben Nevat? Don't all answer at once. He was a king. Okay, he was a king. Well, he wrestled the kingship away from, or tried to away from, the heir apparent, let's call him, following the death of Shlomo. He took the 10 tribes of Israel and made himself king over the northern kingdom, what became known as Malchut Yisrael. In fact, his name, Yeravam, implies a reeve, a fight, a split. Okay, he caused a split in the nation, a civil war, so to speak, by proclaiming himself king. And he's the paradigm of the wicked king. In fact, the Gemara in Sanhedrin says that he has no share in the world to come. But if you take a look in Malachim Aleph, Perek Yud Bet, there it's described how he prevented people from going to Yerushalayim. He made golden calves. He placed them in Beit El and in Dan. He created an idolatrous temple in Beit El to compete with the Beit HaMikdash. There he set up an altar, a Mizbeach, and brought sacrifices and established a new holiday on the 15th of Cheshvan. Now, what's significant about the month of Cheshvan? What don't we have in Cheshvan? We don't have any holidays. There are no holidays in Cheshvan. So it makes sense that he would choose a month that has no holidays to institute a holiday. And he tried to convince people that that's when Chag HaAsif, the harvest or ingathering festival, Sukkot, that's when it should be celebrated in Cheshvan. Because that's when the final crops are gathered up and put into the storehouses. In other words, depending on the season, depending on the year, I suppose, there are still certain crops, or certain produce, maybe some grain, that still stays out in the field a little bit later to get dry before you bring it out into your storehouse. So already by Cheshvan, that's when the final crops are being brought into the storehouses and granaries, etc. So he established this new Chag. And that's what the Ramban is talking about. Okay? But we'll see that if it's a festival that's instituted to commemorate a miraculous salvation, either a salvation that Hashem provides for a community or for a family or an individual, then it is appropriate. And maybe, according to some, even a mitzvah to establish a holiday. Okay? So let's take a look here at source number 2. This is probably one of the earliest recorded examples of such a holiday that we have. This is a fascinating tshuva of the Maharam al-Ashkar, Rabbi Moshe ben Yitzchak al-Ashkar, who lived from 1466 to 1542. He was born in Spain, expelled in 1492. He lived in North Africa and was a rabbi in Cairo. He served on the Beit Din of the Radbaz there, ultimately settling in Israel 3 years before his death, where he lived in Tzfat and Yerushalayim. And he was a major posek. He received questions from Jewish communities throughout the world over. In fact, he would complain that answering all of these inquiries took up too much of his time, kind of like us rabbis on Erev Pesach, okay? All sorts of she'ilot when your wife needs you to kasher the oven, okay? So here, in source number 2, he was posed a question by the Jews of Lepanto, which today is Nafpaktos in western Greece. And here was the question. The leadership there, the Jewish leadership, along with the Beit Din, had created a holiday to be celebrated on the 11th of Tevet to give some thanks, a day of thanksgiving to Hashem for a miraculous salvation. The community was in jeopardy, the Jewish community was under threat, and Hashem provided them a miraculous salvation. And so the leadership decided, the rabbis, the leaders decided to establish a holiday. And so they asked the Maharam al-Ashkar if, number one, the leadership has the authority to establish a holiday. Can they even do such a thing? And then two, if so, is it binding on those no longer living in the community? Is it binding on future generations? Okay, so take a look here at source number 2. He writes the following where I've underlined. Lepanto, Sheila. Anshe ir achathem. Lepanto is the name of a place in Greece. That was the name of the community. Okay, ir achathem ubeitinam tiknu benehem bacharamot v'haskama gdola alehem v'al zaram v'al kol habaim acharehem me'ata ve'ad olam lasot et yom 11 yom lachodesh tevet ki yom purim lechol dvarav. The Beit Din there in Lepanto, the Anshe Ha'ir, the leadership of the community, they established with takanot and charamot and all sorts of rabbinic might and muscle. They established a holiday to be observed like Purim, okay, on the members of the community and on their generations and on all who come after them forever and ever. In order to publicize a miracle that happened to them on that day. So as part of this festival they instituted, part of the takana, part of the institution was that anyone who leaves the community and lives elsewhere, nevertheless they're obligated, they're bound by this day and must observe it forever. So they ask him, Yoreh HaMoreh, please rule, Im yesh koach biyad anshe ir achat, l'taken kiyotze ze olo, v'im takanatam takana, im yochlu ligzor, af al habaim acherim olo. As I said, they ask first, number one, do they even have the authority to make such an edict or enactment? And number two, is it truly binding on future generations and those no longer living there? And he writes, where I've underlined next, Tshuva vaday yecholim heim b'nei ha'ir l'taken b'neihem takanot v'lasot haskamot ugdarim v'liknos ha'over eleihen afilu l'asiya mimidat din Torah. He says that, based on passages in the Talmud, that indeed the leadership of a community does have authority to create such enactments, along with other types of enactments and edicts. Okay, and there, where I've underlined next, Hilchach, therefore, Afal pi shelo haya nichtav t'nai zeh baskamatam, haya alehem l'kaimo b'chol makom shehem v'afilu minhag ba'alma b'lo cherem v'lo haskama. So he says basically, number one, they have the authority to do so, and number two, it is indeed binding on future generations, even those who are no longer living there. And we'll come back to that idea in a few moments. And as I said, throughout Jewish history, there were communities and individuals who established Purims, sometimes families, to commemorate and contextualize and give religious expression to some salvation, some Yeshua, some miracle, just like the Jews of Ponto here in this tshuva. Okay. But the next source here, number 3, comes from the Pri Chadash, Rabbi Chizkiah de Silva. Lived from 1659 to 1698. He was born in Livorno, Italy. Around age 20, he moves to Jerusalem, and he was very unhappy with this practice of creating new holidays. As I said, it wasn't just the community there in Lepanto, Greece, but other communities in Egypt he mentions. And so here in this tshuva, here in source number 3, he's very critical of communities in... It's actually not really a tshuva, it's his comments on the Shulchan Aruch, his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, but he's very critical of communities like Lepanto and communities in Egypt who established these holidays. Okay, he also takes issue with the Jewish community of Cairo for other reasons, and he bases his objection on something called Megillat Ta'anit. Megillat Ta'anit is a list of 35 or 36 festivals which were observed during the Second Temple period. Okay, it's called the Scroll of the Fasts, Megillat Ta'anit, because on these days, which were to be celebrated, fasting and eulogizing was prohibited. Okay, it's basically just like a list. So the Pri Chadash, he cites a Gemara in Rosh Hashanah on Daf Yud Chet, which records a machloket, a dispute, whether or not Megillat Ta'anit, together with the festivals that are described in this Megillah, in this scroll, become null and void following the destruction of the temple. And it's based on a pasuk in Zechariah Perek Chet, very famous pasuk, Perek Chet, Pasuk Yutet, Ko Amar Hashem Tzvakot, Tzom HaRevi'i, V'tzom HaChamishi, V'tzom HaShvi'i, V'tzom HaAsiri, Yelevet Yehuda L'Sason, L'Simcha, U'Lamoadim Tovim, V'Haemet V'Shalom Ehavu. The 4 fasts, which were instituted to mourn for the destruction of the holy temples, those 4 fasts, which we observe, the prophet Zechariah says, will become null and void. They will actually be transformed. Not only will they be null and void, they will be transformed into festivals. We'll go from fasting to feasting with the ultimate redemption. They will be for the house of Yehuda as days of joy and gladness. And they'll be transformed into festivals. So that's why the Talmud says, for instance, that the 4 fasts, Tisha B'Av, the strongest among them, when we achieve redemption, they will be celebrated as festivals. They will be nullified and celebrated as festivals. A whole discussion if with the establishment of the state of Israel, with Jewish sovereignty over Jerusalem, maybe it's time to put this passage here in Zechariah and the Gemara Rosh Hashanah into effect, to say and there was such discussion among the poskim. Maybe Tisha B'Av has a different status. As I mentioned, Tisha B'Av is the most chamur of all those fasts. But in any case, the Gemara also uses this verse to discuss Megillat Ta'anit. And if you take a look here at the very bottom of the page where I've underlined, page 1, V'tama de milta mishum tehakaimelan beperek kama de Rosh Hashanah de batla Megillat Ta'anit. Zulati leChanukah uPurim. The reason for this, meaning the reason for why the Pri Chadash feels it's inappropriate to create new festivals, is because, as we have in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, Daf Yud Chet, it says that when there is sason and simcha, these days will be moadim tovim. When there is joy and gladness, these days will be celebrated as festivals. But when there is not, these days are not celebrated. Okay? Ukidamrin and Hatam, where I've underlined next, Begmara, Rav Rabbi Chanina Amrei, but la Megillat Ta'anit. With the destruction of the temple, the Gemara says that Megillat Ta'anit becomes null and void, and those holidays and festivals that are listed become null and void. Right? Hachi kamar bisman sheyesh shalom yulesason ulesimcha ein shalom tzom. The Talmud says that when there is peace, when there is maybe sovereignty, as some explain, those days will be days of joy and gladness. In the absence of that, those days are observed as fasts. And Megillat Ta'anit, as I said, is batel, along with all of the festivals listed in it. Except for 2, and that's important, and we'll see in a moment. Because Purim and Chanukah were also mentioned in Megillat Ta'anit. And we observe Purim and Chanukah, of course, till this very day. So even according to the opinion in the Talmud, that Megillat Ta'anit becomes null and void with the destruction of the temple and the absence of Jewish sovereignty, and those festivals are no longer observed, that's true, except for the festivals of Purim and Chanukah. They are the exception to the rule. Okay? And that forms the basis of this tshuva of the Chasam Sofer here in source number 4. The Chasam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, we'll talk about him in a few moments. Very, very important. Acharon, of course. Okay? He defends the practice here in this tshuva of creating new holidays, and he cites the Pri Chadash that we just saw, and argues that even according to the opinion that Megillat Ta'anit is null and void with the destruction of the temple, but the holidays of Chanukah and Purim were never nullified. Take a look where I've underlined here in source number 4. Ulefi ani da'ati, deleta l'chol davar avzal. He's arguing with the Pri Chadash. Taham b'vuar perak kama de Megillah Yudalid, or be'erechin. Okay. De mishacharav beit HaMikdash, huchshiru kol ha'aratzot lamar shira. Following the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, so then it's permitted to sing shira not only on miracles that happen in Eretz Yisrael, but all other places. That's how the Gemara defends the concept, at least in theory, of reciting Hallel on Purim. Now you'll tell me, Rabbi, we don't recite Hallel on Purim, and there are different reasons for that. One is that the Megillah itself is in place of a Hallel. Maybe it's a form of Hallel. Another answer is that even following the Purim miracle, we still did not achieve Jewish sovereignty. We were still under Persian rule, the Persian Median Empire. We were still avadim to Achashverosh, actually is the language that the Gemara uses there. But the Gemara says, at least in theory, it could be appropriate to recite Hallel for a miracle that took place outside the land of Israel following the destruction of the Holy Temple. So you can sing Shira for a miracle that takes place in Greece or in Egypt or other parts of the world. Okay, v'dochach lomar de Rava shubatra sfira lehu nami lo batla or sfira nami lo batla Megillat Ta'anit. Utu tzrichim lavin b'maskanot halacha maskinan batla Megillat Ta'anit chutz mi Chanukah uPurim. Okay, that last phrase, that last sentence is crucial. Even according to the opinion that the scroll of the fasts, Megillat Ta'anit, is batla, and so all of the festivals therein become null and void, but it's chutz mi Chanukah uPurim, except for Chanukah and Purim. They are the exceptions to the rule. And so therefore, if you pattern a holiday after Chanukah or Purim, that should be permitted. Okay. And where I've underlined next, he writes, "V'anan kaimalan batla chutz mi Chanukah mishum de mefarse mitzvata uPurim mishum de ein lo shayachut beveit hamikdash klal." Okay, we continue to observe Chanukah because we want to celebrate and make public the miracle, publicize the miracle, and Purim because it had no connection to the Beit HaMikdash. So with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, it should not affect Purim. It should not nullify Purim. And so creating a holiday to publicize a miracle for the Chatam Sofer is permitted. And not just that, we'll see, according to the Chatam Sofer, it's a mitzvah. And not just a mitzvah, but according to the Chatam Sofer, it's a biblical obligation. It's a mitzvah min haTorah. And one who does not establish a holiday, according to the Chatam Sofer, for some sort of miraculous salvation, he is in violation of a positive command. He is over in a mitzvah aseh. I mean, that is an incredible statement. That's an incredible chiddush. Okay? Yes? Oh, so we'll see. We'll take a look at another tshuva of the Chatam Sofer in a moment. Okay, good. Okay, good. So fine. So he concludes this tshuva by noting how he and his Rebbe, Rav Natan Adler, were careful to observe Purim Frankfurt, also known as Purim Vince, even though they no longer were living in Frankfurt. And as you know, I mentioned Chasim Sofer, Major Posek, Major Achron. He was the Rav and Rosh Yeshiva in Presburg, which today is Slovakia. It was Bratislava. Okay. Or I should say Presburg, which was in Hungary. Today, Presburg is Bratislava, which is in Slovakia. Right. So what was Purim Frankfurt or Purim Vincennes? This is a fascinating story. Okay, fascinating footnote here to Jewish history. So Vincennes Fettmilch was a grocer and gingerbread baker who led a popular uprising in Germany between 1612 to 1616. And of course, just like today, they demanded a lower cost of living, lower prices. They wanted to get rid of foreigners, competition. Sounds a lot like what's been going on in Europe in recent years, right? And when things are bad, who do you blame, of course? You blame the Jews. Okay, the Jews who they viewed as competition, the Jews who were engaged in usury, lending with interest. And so on August 22nd of 1614, Vincennes Fettmilch led a mob that stormed the Judengasse, Jews' Lane, and they attacked Frankfurt's Jewish community, stealing and looting, forcing them to flee the city until the emperor himself personally intervened. And on February 28th, 1616, so we're talking almost 2 years later, good year and a half later, on the 20th of Adar, Fet Milch and 6 others were executed in Frankfurt's Ross Market. That's the Horse Market Square. And by the way, that square is still there today in the center of the city. You can visit it. I've been to Frankfurt. I've seen it. And on the same day, the Jews were allowed back into their community, into the Judengasse, into their homes. They were escorted back by the imperial soldiers. And above the gates to the Judengasse, they placed a stone with the imperial eagle. And it bore the inscription, "Protected by the Roman imperial majesty and the Holy Empire." And so the community established the day, the 20th of Adar, as Purim Frankfurt, or Purim Winz. As I said, I've been to Frankfurt before. I have students there. And the day is still observed to this very day by the Jewish community in Frankfurt. Take a look here. He writes, "V'hinei muvor b'sefer Yosef Omer," it's a very important work, who describes Mehanes Shenasa Bekila Kedosha Frankfurt de Main, Frankfurt am Main, Biyom Chaf Adar, the 20th of Adar Rishon, the first Adar, Kavubo Yom Simcha L'Doratam. They established a day, a festive day for generations. V'chein Ra'iti. He says, I saw, Mori, Rabbi Hagon, Natan Adler, Zatzal, Mialdai Kila Kedosha Ahi, V'chein Anu Noagim Acharav, Hagam She'anu Berachok Makom, or Berichuk Makom. We observe this, he says, my Rebbe and I, the Chatam Sofer, before moving to Bratislava, or back then Presburg, he came from Frankfurt. So he says, myself, along with my Rebbe, we observed Purim Frankfurt. Okay? So, take a look at source number 8. This is another tshuva here. This is another tshuva, where the Chatam Sofer in source number 8, he is actually addressing a different question altogether. He's discussing the Kedusha, the sanctity of Jerusalem, and how Jerusalem retains its sanctity even following the destruction of the Holy Temple. And there he goes off on a tangent, and he actually talks about Lag BaOmer, which was observed this week. Right? So, this is an interesting discussion. We discussed this a little bit last week when we explored the historicity of Lag BaOmer and asked the question, what are we really celebrating, if anything? And really that's the very question that the Chatam Sofer asks. As I said, he begins the tshuva by addressing the sanctity of Jerusalem. And then he goes off on a tangent and starts talking about Lag BaOmer. And he's very upset with those who celebrate Lag BaOmer and make these pilgrimages up to Meron. They ascend to Meron. He saw it as a slight to Yerushalayim, to the kavod of Jerusalem. Chutzpah. We're supposed to go on Aliyah L'Regel to Jerusalem. Here people are making these pilgrimages, and instead of going to Jerusalem, they're going up to Meron and Tzfat. So he was very upset about that. Parenthetically, he has, I think I mentioned it last week, he has a drasha in his drashot. It's really a hesped for those who died in this awful earthquake in Tzfat in the 1830s, like 1836, 1837, which took so many lives, and the whole city of Tzfat was destroyed by this earthquake. And in this hesped, this eulogy, he actually indicts them. He indicts the people of Tzfat for having chosen to settle in the north, in Tzfat, as opposed to settling in Jerusalem. So many came from Europe in the early 19th century, the Talmidei Hagra, the Talmidei HaBaal Shem Tov, the old Yeshuv, or the first Yeshuv, the first Aliyah. And many settled in Tzfat, in Tiberia, in those places up north. And so he's very critical. He sees it as a slight to the kavod of Jerusalem. So too here. He says people go up to Meron, and then he asks, what are they actually celebrating? And look what I've underlined here in source number 8. He says, "Aval likboa moed shelo na'asa bo nes v'lo huzkar b'shasu poskim b'shum makom v'remez uremiza. Rak miniat hesped v'ta'anit min hagahu v'tameh gufa lo yadana." He says, I don't understand, to create a holiday when there is no miracle that happened, and it's not mentioned. As I said last week, Lag BaOmer is not mentioned anywhere in rabbinic literature. It's not in the Mishnah, it's not in the Gemara, he says it's not in Shas and Poskim. There's not even a hint to it. what do you find? Just a reference to the fact that the customs of mourning that are observed during this period are suspended on Lag BaOmer. Right, as we saw last week, that's when the Rishonim record. Some Rishonim record, the Chachmei Provence record, B'Shem HaGaonim, in the name of earlier sources. They had a tradition that on Lag BaOmer, that's when the students of Rabbi Akiva stopped dying. So he says it's one thing to suspend the customs of mourning, but it's another thing to celebrate it as a holiday. There's no source for that. He says, I don't know the reason for it, he writes. And then he continues and says, but establishing a holiday for a miraculous salvation, for when either a community, like we saw in a previous tshuva of his, the community of Frankfurt, or an individual experiences a Yeshua, a salvation, that is an obligation. And he says it's a Torah obligation. Now you asked a great question. What's the source? So he bases himself on a number of passages in the Gemara which seem to speak to the responsibility of reciting Hallel, right, and celebrating a day when we go from Mita L'Chaim. Right, there's a few passages, Gemara in Megillah and Pesachim, which talk about how and why they instituted the recitation of Hallel. And Hallel is recited when one's life is in jeopardy, when one's life is in danger, when there's some sort of imminent threat, and Hashem provides a miraculous salvation. So he sees that as a Torah obligation. And he says something incredible. Look where I've underlined towards the bottom of page 3. Dekfiyat yom moed biyom asiyat nes hu kal v'chomer d'oraita. It's a kal v'chomer d'oraita. It's based on this Gemara that says, when you go from Mita L'Chaim lo kol shekain, right? All the more so when you go from the threat of death and destruction to life, when there's a salvation, all the more so, the Gemara says. So he sees that as a kal v'chomer d'oraita. Okay? I'm sorry? Well, it's based on Shirat Hayam. It's based on Shirat Hayam. Just as the Jews sang Shira upon leaving Egypt and thanking Hashem for that miraculous salvation. So we have an obligation upon every miraculous salvation to sing Shira, to lift our voice and recite Hallel. Okay. Okay, so this is a chiddush. It's a good question. Good, I'm glad you're asking. This is the chiddush of the Chatam Sofer. Okay, this is the chiddush of the Chatam Sofer, right? Because you'll see what he says. He says, "Ulefi aniyot dati." He admits that it's in his humble opinion. He says, "In my humble opinion, lefi zeh Yom Purim v'Yimei Chanukah deoraita heim." Purim and Chanukah are min haTorah. Min haTorah. I was always taught that Purim and Chanukah were midrabanan, right? The rabbis instituted them. They don't appear in the Torah. But what he means is that at their very core, by their very nature, establishing a day and giving thanks to Hashem, either through Hallel or with the recitation or the reading of the Megillah, which is in place, as I mentioned, of Hallel, maybe a form of Hallel, by its very nature, that is, in a sense, a mitzvah min haTorah. To recognize a miraculous salvation, give thanks to Hashem, that is min haTorah. Okay, again, I admit, it's a chiddush. He writes, "Ulefi aniyot da'ati," in my humble opinion, lefiza Yom Purim v'Yimei Chanukah deoraita heim. They are min haTorah. Achma la'asot bahem. As far as what to do on them, how to give expression to this day, right? How to celebrate, that's midrabanan. Im lishloch manot, if it's to give out shalach manis, or lahadlik neirot, or to light candles, or lasot zecher acher, zeu derabanan, or to make some other commemoration, that is what is rabbinic. Va'over ve'eno seshum zecher limei Chanukah b'Purim over al mitzvot aseh deoraita. He says that someone who doesn't give any expression to these important days and doesn't make any commemoration, doesn't do anything to mark these days, he is in violation of a positive Torah mitzvah. Okay? Maybe even if you don't fulfill the mitzvah d'Rabbanan of giving shalach manos or reading the Megillah, but so long as you do something to mark the day, to celebrate the day, to give thanks to Hashem, that would be acceptable as far as not violating this mitzvah min haTorah. You might be in violation of not listening to the rabbis, right? Which happens to be also a mitzvah min haTorah, because we're commanded to listen to the rabbis, but that's a separate discussion. Okay. He says you're only in violation of you're only a rabbinic sinner. You're only in violation of rabbinic law if you don't do what the rabbis told you to do on these days. Havei kal v'chomer d'oraita lomar shira kemo shetzivah b'Pesach l'saper yetziat Mitzrayim b'peh. Right? Hachinami mimavet l'chayim chayav lomar shira b'peh dafka. And he compares it to how on Pesach we have a mitzvah min haTorah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. As I said, Shirat Hayam, we give thanks and expression to Hashem dafka b'peh. Okay. In any case, very important tshuva of the Chatam Sofer, and one of the sources that the chief rabbinate, along with major poskim, looked at when deciding on how to give religious expression to Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim and establish those days as festivals. Not just national holidays, but religious holidays. They understood that these are days of religious significance and meaning, tremendous and profound religious significance and religious meaning, if you look at the history of the Jewish people, and they deserve religious expression. Okay, and as I said, you have tens of communities. For instance, here, let's see. I didn't put it on the sheets, but you have communities that established Purims, sometimes with the recitation of Hallel and special tefillot, sometimes with a special seudah. Sometimes they would fast the day before, like Esther, like going from the threat of destruction, fasting, going from Evel to Yom Tov, right? And then the next day would be celebrated with a special feast. Sometimes they would even write a special Megillah to commemorate the event. And if you'll turn the page to the last page, page number 4, at the very bottom, I put 2 pictures here, pictures that I took myself. Okay, the first is a Saragossa scroll, which I saw in the Jewish Museum in Istanbul, which commemorates Purim Saragossa, a miraculous salvation like Purim that took place in Saragossa, Spain. And the Jews decided to commemorate that day by instituting a festival and even writing a Megillah to be read. And the story goes as follows, fascinating story, in either 1380 or 1420. It's quite a span, but either under Peter IV or Alfonso V, king of Aragon, there was a Meshumad, a Jew who had converted to Christianity by the name of Marcos. And the story went as follows. Each year, the Jews there in Saragossa would bring the Sifrei Torah out to the street when the king would come marching by. There would be a parade, the king would come marching by, and in order to give honor to the king, they would bring out the Sifrei Torah. Now you know the Sfaradim, the Spanish Jews, Eidot HaMizrach, they have these beautiful Torah cases. But they felt it was maybe a slight to the honor of the Torah, maybe inappropriate if they would actually bring out the scroll. So what would they do? They would leave the scroll in the ark, or the scrolls in the ark, and they would just bring out those beautiful cases. Okay, so Marcos, having been a Jew, once a Jew, always a Jew, being a Jew who had converted to Christianity, so he knew about this charade, and he wanted to expose the Jewish community. So he told the king, or he informed the king of this act of disrespect and defiance, and he was ready to get the Jewish community in trouble. The king was furious when he heard about this, and so they decided they were going to investigate. Well, when the day came, right, the king was prepared. He had special guards who were going to force the Jews to open up their Torah cases and see if the scrolls indeed were inside or not. But according to the story, the night before the parade, none other than Elijah the prophet appeared before one of the Gabaim, informing him of Marcos's plot and foiling his plan. And so when the guards forced the Jews the next day to open up the cases, it revealed that indeed there were scrolls inside, they were not empty. And the king instead ordered Marcos to be hanged, and the Jewish community was saved. So the Jews of Saragossa decided to establish a holiday, a festival like Purim, and commemorate this miraculous salvation, celebrated on the 17th and 18th of Shvat. And as part of the celebration, each year the scroll is read. And when the name Marcos is mentioned, you can imagine what those listening do. Instead of Haman, when they hear Marcos, they make noise, they bang. Okay, so how did this scroll get to Istanbul? Well, of course, following the expulsion from Spain, there were many Jews who came to Turkey from Spain. Okay, and their descendants continued to celebrate Purim Saragossa to this very day. The second Megillah on the bottom is a picture that I took in the Jewish Museum in Budapest, which is part of the Doheny Synagogue, and I'm calling it a Horthy era scroll because it describes what the Jews of Hungary went through. Nicholas Horthy was a region of Hungary from 1920 to 1944. In 1938, Hungary allied itself with the Germans. They did terrible things to the Jews. Horthy himself was terrible to the Jews. And the scroll tells the story of what the Jews of Hungary endured before the war and during the war. Okay? Other famous Purims you have in Hebron, Window Purim. What is Window Purim? In 1741, the authorities, the Ottomans, they put a massive tax on the Jewish community, and unable to find the necessary money, they gathered together to pray, and the next morning, lo and behold, they found a bag of money sitting there on the windowsill. Just enough to pay the ransom and save the community. Okay? I guess a good fundraising technique, maybe. Hebron has another Purim, the Purim of Ibrahim Pasha, which the community celebrates having been saved from the invading Egyptians. So now it's interesting, Purim already celebrates 2 days out of Safek, right? Whether it was a walled city or an unwalled city. So they celebrate already the 14th and 15th of Adar, both days of Purim in Adar. And now they have 2 other Purims. Okay, so altogether they have 4 Purims. All right, they like to celebrate there. There's not enough Purims, I guess. But as I said, you have many, many communities, tens of communities who established these Purims. They call them a Purim Sheni, a day to be observed like Purim and celebrate some miraculous salvation. And it's not just communities, but individuals and families celebrate personal Purims. Rav Yom Tov Lipman Heller, the Tosfos Yom Tov, known for his famous comments on the Mishnah. He was a student of the Maharal in Prague. He was a Rav in Krakow. And as the story goes, he was held on some trumped-up charges. And when he was released, he proclaimed a personal Purim for himself and his family. It includes a fast day to commemorate the day he was imprisoned and a Yom Tov to celebrate his release. His descendants observe this Purim till this very day. Here, in source number 5, here's the Chaye Adam. In Hilchot Purim, he discusses how, or I've underlined, Misha Iralone, someone who has a miracle that they are the recipient of, a miracle happened to them, V'kol shekin b'nei ha'ir, and all the more so, members of a community, Yecholim l'taken b'haskama leihem v'al haba'im achareihem lasot oto yom lepurim. The Chai Adam, Rav Avram Danziger, very important posek, he says they have the authority, as we saw before, Paskins like the Maram al-Ashkar, they have the authority to create for themselves a holiday like Purim. V'nireli de'ota suda shosin b'shvil hanes hi sudat mitzvah af lefi dvarav. And he says that, even he's citing the Pri Chadash, who was against the practice, but he believed, nevertheless, it's even in light of what the Pri Chadash writes, it's a mitzvah, and creating such a suda is a mitzvah. And then he goes on to describe, towards the end of the passage, I'll just summarize for the sake of time, he goes on to describe how there was this powder keg explosion in 1804, and it destroyed his home together with many other homes, and 31 people were killed. But he and his family, only an inch away from death, they survived with just minor injury. And so he made a personal Purim, a personal Yom Tov for himself and his family, and he called it Pulver Purim. In Yiddish, pulver is gunpowder Purim. Chomer Nefetz in modern Hebrew. And he goes on to describe just how they would observe it, how they would light candles, and they would say certain Mizmorei Tehillim, and they would learn Torah, and they would have a Su'udah, they would give tzedakah, etc. So you have many, many examples of individuals and families and communities who established these Purims. Okay? And so as I said, the chief rabbinate, together with leading authorities following the establishment of the State of Israel, and later, following the miraculous events of June 1967, established Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim as religious holidays. Not just national holidays, but religious holidays, right? Legal holidays. In the United States, and you have what's called a legal holiday. I think in the UK you call it a bank holiday, right? So a legal holiday, but when I say a legal holiday, I mean halakha, Jewish law. Okay, a halachically legal holiday. And they pattern these days after these precedents, after these Purims. Okay, now before we conclude, just take a look here at source number 9. This is a very important tshuva from Rav Mesholem Rota. He was a major posek at the time of the Hakamat HaMedina. He was a Galicianer Gaon. He came from a Hasidic family. He was a Rav in Ukraine and in Romania before escaping the Nazis and making his way to Israel. And he was asked about Hallel and the recitation of the bracha of Shehechianu by Rav Yehuda Leib HaKohen Maimon. Rav Yehuda Leib Fishman Maimon, Israel's first minister of religion, who recited famously the bracha of Shehechianu b'Shem u'v'malchut, with God's name, at the signing of the Declaration of Israel's independence on that fateful Friday, Hey Be'iyar, Tafshin Chet. Right? He got up and he made the Shehechianu, and everyone there, all assembled, answered Amen. Very, very famous. So he asked him about reciting Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut and reciting the bracha of Shehechianu. Okay? And he writes the following. And I think this is pertinent to our discussion this morning, even though we're not really talking about Hallel or Shehechianu. He writes, where I've underlined, Hine ein safek shayom hahu he'iyar shenigva al yedei hamemshala v'chavrei hakneset shehem nivcharei rov hatzibur v'rov gdolei harabanim lachog oto b'chol haaretz zechel hanes shel tshuatenu v'cherutenu mitzvah la'asoto simcha v'yom tov v'lomar Hallel. He says there is no safek, there's no doubt, this special day, the 5th of Iyar, which was instituted by the members of Knesset, who are elected by the majority, and that has maybe halachic significance. We've seen in the past a famous tshuva of Rav Kook to that effect, and many great rabbis who've decided to celebrate this day throughout the land. By the way, it wasn't only instituted for Ezrachei Medinat Yisrael. With their enactment, Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim was established for Jews all over. It was to be celebrated by Jews here in Israel and Jews in the diaspora as well. As part of the official takanot of the Rabbanut, they use such language, Jews in Israel and in the diaspora. Okay? So he says it's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to make those days of simcha and Yom Tov, and to recite Hallel. ואף ציבור שבעיר אחת היחידים שקובעים עליהם יום טוב לעצמם על נס שנעשה להם, חייבים לקיים עליהם ועל זרעם והבאים מאחריהם עד עולם. And as we saw in a number of sources, right? By the way, we saw the Chai Adam. I'll just point out that the Magen Avraham here in source number 6 in Hilchot Purim, as well as the Mishnah Brura in source number 7 in Hilchot Purim, also record and rule that a community has the authority to establish such a day, to celebrate a day like Purim, on which an individual or a community was the recipient of a miraculous salvation. Okay? So he says there's a precedent, and a community has the authority to do so, and to obligate members of the community and their descendants for all future generations. So this has halachic weight. This is not just something yesh me'ayin out of thin air that the chief rabbinate invented. But we have precedent in halacha, and you have tens and tens of communities that established such Purims. I just gave you a few examples. And look where I've underlined next. Memela pshita b'nidon didan hanogel tzibur shel klal Yisrael. V'yesh kan pidyon me'avdut lecherut. Certainly when talking about klal Yisrael here, we're talking about not just a salvation limited to a specific community, but to all of Klal Yisrael, who went from avdut to cherut, from bondage to freedom. Shnigalenu mishibud malchiot. We were redeemed from the rule of the exile and of the kingdoms. V'na'asenu b'nei chorin. And we have been made free men. V'sagnu atzmaut mamlachtit. And we've achieved political independence. So he even views political independence not just as something political. He calls it, political independence, sovereignty maybe. But that's not insignificant. That's not something that is just, the result of political aspirations and machinations over the last 100 years. I mean, you can ask, were all the Ben Gurions and British mandates and Balfour declarations, right? Were they just the product of the last 100 years of political aspirations and machinations? The pressure of the Zionist movement? Or were all those Ben Gurions and British mandates and Balfour declarations and partition plans part of Hashem's plan, part of Hashem's mandate, part of this process of the ingathering of the exiles, and part of this process of redemption that we're witnessing in front of our very eyes? Maybe it's only the beginning. Maybe it's only Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu, the first flowering of the redemption. But for Rav Meshulam Rota, Kol Mevaser, he saw this as something significant. It has halachic significance. It has tremendous religious significance and meaning, that we've achieved political independence and Jewish sovereignty in our land. V'gam hatzalah mimita l'chaim shenitzalu midei oivenu she'amdu aleinu l'chalotenu, and that we went from the threat of death and destruction to life, and we were saved from our enemies who tried to destroy us. Bivadai chova aleinu. Certainly we have an obligation. We are obligated likboa Yom Tov, to establish a festival. V'yafeh Kivnu haminhagim shekavu, or manhigim, excuse me. V'yafeh kavano kivinu hamanhigim shekavu et hayom hazeh dafka. And dafka, it's significant that the leadership established this day. There's a whole discussion. Should it really be the 5th of Iyar? Even those who said, well, we have to celebrate our independence and we have to create a festival to celebrate salvation. But what happened the moment that Israel declared its independence? War, right? War broke out. So, but he said, no, dafka this day, okay? Asher bo haya ikar hanes sheyatzanu me'avdut lecherut al yidei hachrazat ha'atzmaut. Dafka this day, when we went from avdut to cherut, from bondage or slavery to freedom, through the announcement, through the declaration of our independence, okay? Jewish sovereignty. After 2,000 years, Jewish sovereignty on our land. That possesses tremendous religious significance and meaning. And what followed, following the nes, the miracle of our independence, was the miracle of going from being saved from mavet to chayim, from death to life. Hen b'milchamtenu neged ha'aravim. Eretz Israel, the war against the Arabs here in Israel. V'hein hatzalat Yehudi hagola, or Yehudei hagola, miyad oiveihem b'mekomot megureihem shalu le'eretz Israel. Okay? Uba al yedei kach hanes hashlishi shel kibbutz galuyot. And then third miracle, the fact that all of a sudden Jews around the world in the diaspora have a home. They can come home. Those Jews who need a place of refuge can flee to the land of Israel. This nes of kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of the exiles. Very, very important tshuva. Rav Gold, who you all know, Rav Gold, his name was Rav Meshulam Roth. Rav Meshulam Roth, or Rota, as I mentioned. Rav Shalom Gold, who created the adult education program here at the Israel Center, which we all benefit from. He's my predecessor at the shul where I have the privilege to serve as rabbi. He's our founding rabbi and rabbi emeritus. Rav Shalom Gold told me that when Rav Meshulam Roth wrote this tshuva, there were other poskim, maybe those who were not so favorable to the state of Israel, didn't view it so favorably, maybe not so much in favor of Yom HaAtzmaut or Yom Yerushalayim. There were those who claimed that Rav Meshulam Roth was experiencing cognitive decline, that he had dementia when he could write such a thing about the state of Israel. Obviously, that's not true, right? That's a terrible thing to say, because if you look at this tshuva, he wouldn't have been able to write such a beautiful tshuva. Obviously, he viewed the establishment of the state of Israel as nothing short or nothing less than a modern-day miracle. I'll just end with two passages from the Talmud. The Gemara in Shabbat on Daf Kuf Yud Chet, here in source number 10, says, "Hakoreh Hallel b'chol yom harei ze mecharef umegadef." Someone who says Hallel every single day, he's called a blasphemer. What does it mean that he's guilty of blaspheming? Mecharef u'megadef. If a person says Hallel every single day, then in a sense they're making light of when Hallel needs to be said, when it should be said. If you say Hallel and give praise and thanks to Hashem for every little thing, obviously we have tremendous Hakarat HaTov, but if you turn every day into a festival and you say Hallel for every single day and every little thing, that cheapens it, right? That cheapens it. However, the Gemara in Sanhedrin and Daf Tzadi Dalid criticizes Chizkiyahu for not raising his voice and singing Shira and reciting Hallel upon the downfall of Sancherev, Melech Ashur, where I've underlined Chizkiyahu, she'asit lo kol anisim halalu velo amar Shira lefanecha taseu Mashiach. The Gemara there says he could have been made Messiah, could have been made Mashiach, but for the fact that he didn't give praise and thanks, he didn't say Shira, he didn't recite Hallel upon the downfall of Sancherev Melech Ashur. He failed to give that tremendous salvation, that miracle religious expression. Let us not make the same mistake. On the one hand, to say Hallel every single day, the Gemara in Shabbat says, that cheapens it. But to fail to recognize a day of tremendous religious significance and meaning, and not give it religious expression, as we saw according to the Chatam Sofer, maybe you are over on a mitzvah min HaTorah, okay? But certainly that is a failure. If you don't give a day when either a person, a community, as we saw, or the people of Israel experience a miraculous salvation, if you fail to contextualize it, to concretize it, to crystallize it, so that is a failure. Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim are days of tremendous religious significance and meaning, and they are days that deserve religious expression. I will not be here next Wednesday. I will be celebrating Yom Yerushalayim as part of Mizrachi's Israel 360 in Memphis, Tennessee. But I'll be back, Be'ezrat Hashem, before Shavuot. But we won't be meeting next week, nor the following week. We will be meeting, Be'ezrat Hashem, after Shavuot, and then we will start a brand new mini-series, a special summer series, looking at Torah and technology. Take care. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful week. A Yom Yerushalayim Sameach, and a Chag Sameach, a good, as we say on Shavuot, it's a good Kabbalas HaTorah. Okay, you should be zocha to receive the Torah. Be'ahava u'b'simcha. Amen. We'll see you after Shavuot.